from a region that was known for having a lot of wise men, Teman, and that's thought to be in the area of Edom. And of the four companions, he showed the most compassion and consideration for Job's predicament. And he accepts him as a godly person who had sadly sinned and suffered the consequence. So again, he was understanding, but he also had the opinion that there had to be a particular serious sin that Job committed in order to suffer so much, as opposed to the sense that, suffering just happens in life and doesn't have to be just a punishment for a sin. Bildad was also possibly an Edomite or an Aramean. His name means Adad is Lord. Adad was a local storm god in addition to Baal. But that was in the Edomite region. That was the storm god of the Edomite region, areas that are east of the Jordan. And in Canaan, Baal was the storm god. And knowing that might help us understand what he says, the theological views he has, which is probably coming from the influence of these polytheistic religious context. And so he particularly told Job that he thought Job was guilty of blasphemy for questioning God's justice. Just to even raise a question or to consider the issue of theodicy, how does God's justice relate to such kinds of tragedies in the world, he thought was blasphemy. And he said that Job's family got what it deserved. And he warned Job of impending doom if he did not repent. So again, Bildad was less understanding and more harsh, and but still had the view that Job could only be suffering this way if he was being punished for a specific sin, rather than understanding that even a righteous person can suffer just because they live in a fallen world. And the person doesn't have to do something specific for God to punish him. And you can see how that kind of mindset goes back to this idol type of worship, where you had a storm god like Baal with this lightning bolt in his hand, and that he would, zap you if you potentially, or he could if he wanted to. He could just zap you in some way with disaster or disease if you did something he didn't like. But that's a purely idolatrous and polytheistic way of looking at God. But that was the approach he took, coming from his background and his worship of a false deity and having the theology of these polytheistic places. So he thought Job needed to repent. Job's problem was that he couldn't think of any particular sin that was so serious he would deserve to be punished. So he didn't know what it was he needed to repent of. Zophar also likely came from Edom, or perhaps the area we call North Arabia. And his advice to Job was the most bitter of all the others, and very scathing. He told Job to repent, or he would die the painful death he deserves. So he's much more, he's not at all understanding, and simply says, you've done something wrong, you have to repent. If you don't repent soon, then you're going to, God's going to kill you. Then there was Elihu. His name means he is my God. He seems to be from a clan, a Semitic clan close to Job's family. Perhaps what's called the Buzites. Job is said to be an Uzite in the opening verse of the book. Buz was Abraham's nephew in Genesis 31:47. And he defers, or Elihu here defers to the others due to his youth. And so his speeches are limited. And we see that in chapters 32 to 37. And he was very angry with Job for trying to justify himself as not deserving such punishments. So for Elihu, Job's saying, well, I don't know what I did wrong. I don't seem to deserve this. He took that as Job just simply trying to be self-righteous and pretend that he didn't do anything wrong. But it is Elihu, of course, who seems himself very self-righteous. So at a certain point, these three men stopped answering Job because they figured, well, he's just righteous in his own eyes. His righteousness is just something he sees, but others don't see it. So was he self-righteous? Was that just their opinion? Job insisted he had done nothing wrong. He didn't insist that he had never sinned, but he insisted that he can't think of any particular grievous type sin he had done that would just deserve this severe kind of punishment. And we also have God himself declaring how righteous and blameless Job is in the first chapter. So the mistake that they all are making, Job and the people talking to him, is that they have this belief that if you suffer some kind of tragedy, that is proof that you sinned in some special way, and so God punished you. You deserved it. But that's, as I've indicated, that's a perception that comes from the ancient Near East, and it's polytheistic, idolatrous, religious way of thinking. But it's not Christian thinking, nor was it correct Hebrew theology related to the Hebrew scriptures. Old Testament Jews interpreted certain deaths or destruction as sent by God as punishment for sin. But this was very selective. So is the text teaching that God did it, or just that those people thought he did it? In those texts, God does not come across as gracious or forgiving. In general, God is patient, but perhaps at times he acts as a warning. For example, when we see Ananias and Sapphira judged in the book of Acts. So there can be specific times when some kind of punishment comes seemingly just out of the blue, and perhaps by God's directive, but it comes in only special situations. Every time someone is hurt, should not be interpreted as God doing something to punish them. In Job 2:4-5, we read, a man will give all he has for his own life, but stretch out your hand and strike his flesh and bones, and he will surely curse you to your face. That was what Satan, or the Satan, this accuser, was in this story. The one called the accuser is saying this to God, that if you cause him to have enough personal pain, then he'll curse you. And again, we see this word barak used. We talked about literally bless you, but it may have been put in the manuscript to cover up the original word for curse, or you can read it sarcastically, bless you, but meaning the opposite. And of course, we have poetry and parallelism in Job. Here's a good example of a restatement. Who, being clean, has ever been destroyed? Where or when were the upright ever eliminated? So you have two lines with the same three kinds of elements making a similar statement, that the person saying this is asking, well, when has a righteous person ever had trouble? But of course, that leads to the whole point that the book's trying to teach. Righteous people can have trouble. That's not an indication the person deserved punishment. So I want to just move ahead. Just to wrap up Job, the bottom line to the theology that we have in the book of Job. Basically, this book teaches us that the rain falls on the just and the unjust, that problems and pain may occur for reasons known only to God. The suffering of a godly person is not proof of sin. The most righteous person can suffer greatly, and the wicked person escape tragedy. Suffering is not deserved. God never promised no pain and prosperity for godly people. At least he didn't promise it exclusively. He promised that being godly increases the odds that you will have a less painful and more prosperous life. But it doesn't work like a mathematical formula, because the rain falls on the just and the unjust for whatever reasons. And those are things that we often never know or can know. But we have this situation that we're always frustrated because we wish we did know. We would like to know, why did something happen? What was the purpose for it? And that's rarely ever made clear. And that also goes back to the idea that in the garden, that the tree that provided understanding about right and wrong could mean the tree that provided understanding about everything. Right and wrong being a literary device for completeness. So in that way, the idea was that if they ate from this tree, they'd be like God. They would understand why everything happened. And that would be a tremendous temptation to be able to, if you just ate a fruit, to be able to all of a sudden have the ability to relieve all of your anxiety over why things happened. You'd, like God, know the reason for everything, and you would have no questions left. So if that were promised, that could be quite tempting. Regardless, in Job, we see that suffering can either take you closer to or farther away from God. It's our choice. How do we handle our suffering? Do we allow it to make our relationship with God worse, or to improve it? Also, we should not demand answers from God or question his motives. we have to trust God in spite of pain and perplexity. And also that God allows wickedness does not make him the cause of the wickedness or responsible for wickedness. It's only he's only wicked if he causes the wickedness to happen, but he does allow it because he allowed freedom of choice, and his creatures chose to do things that were wicked. And hence we have the history of a fallen human race. I'm going to talk about Psalms later with another PowerPoint presentation. So now I'll just move to the book of Proverbs. So what is a proverb? A proverb can be described as an object lesson based on or using some comparison or analogy. It may be a short saying that provides a general truth, or a lesson drawn from experience, or a common example, or a pattern of future blessing or cursing. And you see there that the examples that I gave for those ideas, none of them came from Proverbs. They're based on Proverbs that we find in Ezekiel, Psalms, and Deuteronomy. So Proverbs that we find throughout the book of Proverbs are not just limited to the book of Proverbs in the Old Testament. It's a wisdom device, and of course, it was used in a variety of situations when people wanted to use a statement of wisdom for a certain purpose. But whoever is using it or wherever you find it, its purpose is to help someone choose the best course of action among those that are available. And the lesson is that the foolish way is to be avoided, and the wise way should always be followed. So there's the foolish way, the path that the foolish person takes, and the path that the righteous person takes, or the wise person takes. But in this area, when we talk about foolishness or wisdom, we're not talking about people who are intelligent versus unintelligent, or smart versus stupid. The fool in Proverbs, the foolish person who chooses the foolish or wicked way, could be a very extremely intelligent person. He could have a very high IQ. He could be a very smart person academically. But the foolishness that's being talked about is moral foolishness. He makes stupid moral choices, even though he might be brilliant as a scientist or a mathematician or a philosopher. So this contrast between the wise and foolish is related to life choices, not to simply intelligence. Why do we have a book of Proverbs? Well, the book itself tells us in the opening chapter, it is there for us to learn how to obtain wisdom and discipline, so we can gain better understanding and insight, so that we can become more disciplined and prudent in life, that we are able to do what's right and what's just and what's fair. for giving us more cleverness, especially to people who are inexperienced, to become more experienced or clever, to provide knowledge and discretion to young people so that they don't make the foolish choices, and for understanding wise proverbs, parables, sayings, and riddles. All of those are the reasons for having this collection of proverbs in this book for people to read and study and try to uh, obtain lessons from. Um, there's actually 7 words that are used in this section of Proverbs chapter 1 about proverbial wisdom. We see the idea of chokmah, or skill, the skill at making wise decisions. Then the word musar, which has to do with order. So being wise in a disciplined way. And then there's being, or insight, the ability to understand what is right. Sakal, instruction, which has to do with the ability to have critical reflection. Uh, then there's the word orma, craftiness, being able to be clever or creative. Then there's the typical word for know, yada, and that has to do with being informed or intelligent, having knowledge that's useful. And then there's mizimah, planning, and that is being able to plan things through and to have discretion in making decisions. And so, like I've already said, the fool in wisdom literature, and especially in Proverbs, is not a person that's stupid mentally, but stupid morally. Even the wise person isn't necessarily a person who's highly intelligent. That's not what the wisdom is about. He could be a person with a low IQ, a person who's actually not very smart and isn't very good academically. But he is good at being smart in terms of making ethical choices, in terms of doing what is spiritual, doing what is righteous instead of doing what is wicked. You don't have to be highly intelligent to make those kinds of choices. It's not a matter of um, intelligence to be spiritual. It's a different kind of intelligence. It's the ability to make the right choices that are wise and righteous. So wisdom and folly have to do with right and wrong behavior, choices that lead to or away from life, physically or spiritually. So some choices will lead you to, in most cases, to a better physical and spiritual situation. Other choices will lead you to a lesser or a more poor physical or spiritual situation. So the key is Proverbs 1:7, which says the fear of the Lord, which in the Hebrew text is the divine name Yahweh. The fear of Yahweh is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and discipline. Um, so, um, to be a wise person that begins with having reverence for God and His commands, and then being willing to put them into action and to make the righteous rather than the unrighteous choice. But a foolish person um, who is foolish ethically or morally he doesn't really respect this kind of wisdom. He might respect knowledge, but he doesn't respect this kind of wisdom that requires discipline of choosing good over bad. Uh, this idea of fear of God is an interesting question. What does it really mean to fear him? To be afraid of him? Because that was what the people following all the idols and the false gods, the polytheistic people, had that kind of theology. They thought of their gods in such a way that they were afraid of them. They couldn't trust them. They were very insecure. They never knew how these gods would act. And so they had a true kind of terror before their gods because they couldn't trust their gods to be fair or honest or just and things like that. So that's why they had to work so hard at sacrifices to make the gods happy. So they might not just randomly be uh, punished somehow by the gods just for fun or for no good reason at all. So they had that kind of terror and real anxiety, that kind of fear. But that's not really the kind of fear that's intended with Yahweh, because he is holy and righteous and just and fair and so forth. So it's more of the kind of respect that's needed because he is God, and we understand our place before God. Um, so we can trust and follow him. But if we're afraid of him in kind of a terror sense, that leads to a different kind of relationship than what the Proverbs is presenting. Um, as I said, these Hebrews who were receiving this revelation, they lived in a world where all the people around them followed gods that were untrustworthy, unpredictable, and they could hurt people who disappoint them, or people who are just minding their own business just because they want to. So they can be cruel and cantankerous, and they can have those kinds of human um, weak kinds of attitudes and actions, which Yahweh does not have by contrast. Although at times, sometimes we read some passages in the Old Testament, and it seems like Yahweh is acting capriciously or callously towards people. Uh, but this also could be that the text is expressed that way because the Hebrews also shared that kind of uh, fear. That's the wrong kind of fear, having been influenced by the polytheism around them. So, of course, revelation is progressive. And so there's much more revelation from God to come uh, after Proverbs, all the way through the New Testament, for us to have a complete package of God's revelation to develop more comprehensive and complete and correct views about God and what he is like and what he wants. So the right kind of respect or fear of God um, can lead us to knowledge. Um, the verse we looked at indicated that we should not be like those who are foolish and try to avoid wisdom and discipline, because those kind of people don't want to submit to God's rules. It suggests that those who fear God are those who seek wisdom and discipline, a skill at living righteously and doing it with self-control in choices about what is right and wrong. So this fear of God is more related to uh, carrying out. If you fear God, then you will seek wisdom and discipline. That's what it means to fear him. You'll want to learn the skill at living righteously. There's even a place in the Old Testament where the fear of God, that expression is used, and it's used parallel or seemingly in a way that it's like another way to talk about God's revelation. His verbal revelation is his fear. So again, it's following his teachings that is the idea uh, that's in view when we talk about fearing God, not being afraid to approach him, but having the confidence in his character that um, we can take on the task of trying to uh, follow his directives, because those directives are coming from someone who is loving and not just angry at us. And so here's the verse I was alluding to, uh, this parallelism in Psalm 111 that says, the fear of the Yahweh is the beginning of wisdom. And then the next line says, all who follow his precepts have good understanding. So when you see it in its poetic form, you can see that the subject is understood in the first line, reverse parallelism again. And then that also, the subject there also includes the verb. Those who have or those who follow is subject and verb. And then the object is in the first line, the fear of Yahweh, then that's restated in the second line as his precepts. So the psalmist who wrote this particular verse, although it wasn't really a verse to him, it was just a bicolon in his poem. But when he wrote it, he, in his second line, brought out this idea of God's precepts, his teachings, his laws, his commands, his directives, all those kinds of things, as a way to parallel this expression about the fear of Yahweh. And of course, in the translate that properly, we'd have to say the fear towards Yahweh. Again, we have this genitive construct we talked about before. So the of word just tells you that you have two words in construct. And so literally the fear of Yahweh, but then what kind of genitive is that? How do you explain that? So you have to make a choice of the options, a fear that comes from Yahweh, which wouldn't make a lot of sense. So it probably means the fear that we have towards Yahweh. Um, Although, if you take it at the fear of Yahweh, of something coming from him, that would make sense if the parallel idea is precepts that come from him. So again, the context and the parallelism helps us think through how do I actually interpret and translate that particular fear. But of course, most Bibles and translations don't really try to interpret it. They just say fear of Yahweh and leave it literal. They leave it for the reader to figure it out. But regardless, you still have this hint here that having a fear towards Yahweh, or some idea of fear from or with Yahweh, also is connected to the fact that he has given commands for us to follow. So if we properly reverence him, that means we would follow his teachings. And then, of course, um, as the parallelism continues, then you have another verb in the second line that's understood in the first, and then the final part, the beginning of wisdom, which is restated as a good understanding. So when we say the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, then we can see that that has to do with seeking understanding about his precepts. And that's how we become wise, not just how we become smart, because it's not about understanding his precepts or laws or his revelation so that we have an intelligent grasp on it. The the goal is wisdom, not just knowledge. And that's why that's used there. The goal is becoming more wise, becoming more skilled at righteous living, not just becoming more informed or knowledgeable about the information of his revelation. Um, and again, in Proverbs 2:5, you see this again uh, about understanding the fear of Yahweh, and then the next line being finding knowledge of Elohim. And the word for knowledge sort of has more to do with experiential knowledge, not just mental information. Uh, and in Proverbs 9:10, we have this more well-known verse that the fear of Yahweh is the beginning of wisdom, but then it's followed by the knowledge of the Holy One is understanding. So again, wisdom is restated as understanding. It's not just knowing, it's having a more um, sense of trying to use the knowledge to gain a more right kind of life rather than just gain uh, knowledge or information. And Proverbs 15:33 says the fear of Yahweh teaches a person wisdom. So again, it's all about moving towards being wise, using knowledge in a way, using God's revelation in a way that we become uh, skilled at life and making the right decisions. And as we've looked at before, we can, of course, find many similar statements in other ancient Near East texts that predate the Hebrew Bible. So there was some influence probably that came from that for the Hebrews, but still, uh, just because they might have borrowed language or an idea from another nation that was even polytheistic and idolatrous, borrowing those wisdom ideas is not the same thing as borrowing theology. So the Hebrews' theology was, of course, very much different than Canaanite theology or Egyptian theology. But as we said before, uh, wisdom is based on experience. And uh, uh, no matter where you live or what time of history you live, if when you live life, you experience how things work out. You find out that if you take certain directions, they tend to be very negative, and they can be risky decisions to make and lead to damage and death uh, or disease. and other decisions lead to prosperity and more health being more likely. And so uh, people living uh, before the Hebrews and before God gave revelation as proverbial wisdom, they had similar experiences and they could draw on life and make certain observations about life and how life works. So um, it's understandable that the Hebrews would also learn a lot learn a lot of the same lessons from living in the world. And so there's no mystery that there would be similar proverbs and guidance and advice given in all. So the Hebrews are not simply learning this from these other cultures. They had some contact, and so they shared wisdom back and forth between cultures and between wise societies that would meet. And so they could share wisdom back and forth. But this kind of wisdom, as we saw in the diagram I showed, is this person to person type revelation. And so people learn wisdom truths about life and then teach other people about them. But this kind of truth, even though it's being learned on a human level, ultimately it's God's revelation because the creation is His, and the way it functions is the way He designed it. And so it's His world that operates by the same moral and physical laws, regardless of who you are and where you live. So the wisdom materials in the Old Testament are unique in that they can also, not everything that's there, but many of the same things that could be learned from experience were learned by other people in other cultures and in earlier times than the Hebrews. So that's why we find sayings in Egypt or Mesopotamia that, or from Canaanite literature, that are almost word for word the same as a Hebrew proverb or a Hebrew piece of wisdom. But that's because uh, they all share life in the same world that the Hebrew God created. So ultimately, those indirect kinds of truths and experiential truths uh, go back and have their source in the world that Yahweh created. Um, so, um, in that sense, they're not completely unique to various cultures, but um, even the cultures that were worshiping idols, they're still learning these lessons in a world that the Hebrew God created. So that He's the source of the wisdom either way. But that's why we find the parallels between these various wisdom writings in different cultures. But it's not because the Hebrews just copied those cultures. Uh, they learned from their experiences uh, the way life works, and also from the revelation that their God gave them. Um, so again, we saw some of this earlier, so we won't look at all this in detail, but you can see here how some Old Testament proverbs are very similar to Egyptian proverbs. Lying lips are an abomination to Yahweh. Uh, the Egyptian proverb, false talk is the abomination of the gods. Um, Humans may devise plans, but Yahweh's purpose is carried out. And the Egyptian said, men speak words on the one hand, but God acts on the other. Uh, do not be a friend with hotheads, or do not associate with a heated person. These are all the kinds of things that you don't have to have direct revelation to learn. You learn from experience that a prostitute's house leads to the grave, or that death is gained through knowing a prostitute. So uh, people that were trying to develop wise advice in either culture could learn these kind of things from the way life works, and just from experience, where people make right and wrong choices. And then as a result, you develop perspectives on what is a good and what's a bad choice to make in life. So wisdom then is experiential knowledge or revelation. We do have some revelation, what we call special revelation, that comes from God directly to a prophet. And it contains truths that we wouldn't know otherwise, and that we wouldn't find in other cultures' religious documents. But proverbial knowledge is learned from experience. So any human at any time in history can observe how life works and write it down as a lesson. So proverbial wisdom is not unique, but the Old Testament collection provides those uniquely provides those truths that Yahweh wanted his people most to follow and remember, even though similar truths exist in the writings of other nations. Uh, Sometimes people ask about or talk about truth being relative. Um, is it sometimes true both ways? Uh, yes, with some kinds of truths, that is true. Sometimes it is relative. And we have this even in the book of Proverbs, where we have these two verses that are following each other. And in the one, it says, don't answer a fool. And in the next one, it says, answer a fool. And there are sometimes people that point to this and say, see, the Bible contradicts itself. It's not consistent. But that doesn't work, because this isn't a didactic kind of propositional uh, literature or communication. It's proverbial, it's wisdom. And in that world of information, there are these relative truths, in that in some situations it's right to do something, but it would be wrong to do it in another situation. And the wise person knows the difference. So there are times when a foolish person doesn't deserve an answer. There may be other situations when a foolish person uh, should be answered, but a wise person knows the difference. So again, similar things like the sparing the rod uh, and hating the child, or is in earlier ancient Near East proverbs, sparing the rod and spoiling the child. Device about not taking advantage of poor people, not moving boundary stones, which has to do with stealing land from somebody else, and so forth. So again, certain types of life experiences lead to certain wise perspectives about how to live in the right way or the wrong way. But the bottom line for Hebrews, the Hebrew people, and their wisdom information, we see in this particular set of verses, where it says, trust in Yahweh with all your heart, which for them that meant, don't follow the other gods. Don't be tempted into that. Just trust Yahweh, and don't lean on your own understanding, but on what he has given you as directives. And in every way, acknowledge him, and then your paths in life will be straight. Proverbs 6 tells us 6 particular things that God hates, although it really is 7 overall. And then that brings us to the end of just some parts of Proverbs that uh, help us understand what's in the book and why it's the way it is. And so that leads us to Ecclesiastes before we also take up Psalms by itself later on. But at this point, we'll take a break for a few minutes and then we will deal with Ecclesiastes.